Thank you. Thank you.
Will I create a disaster by trying to hook up my computer?
Not at all. So, पुष्कर जी ये अभी ऑन है ना हमारा?
ये बस आपके देखने के लिए यहाँ पे कमेंट्स आएंगे तो आपको कुछ करना है.
अच्छा ठीक है.
I don't have a drive, but if you have one,
Thank you. दिक्कत तो ये
बस प्रेस करना चाहिए.
ये डालना चाहिए ना? या ठीक है. थैंक यू. और वो लाइव भी हो गया ना?
दिख रहा है सर. यूट्यूब पे भी लाइव.
Right. So good afternoon to everybody, and thank you so much for coming today, being a Saturday weekend. And I also welcome participants who have joined online, and also online on the WebEx, and also those who have joined on YouTube Live. I must say that this is a very important beginning today, because research training, especially for young researchers, earlier career researchers, ICSSR's doctoral fellows, postdoctoral fellows, doctoral students in the universities all across India, research training, as I said, is a very important responsibility of ICSR, a key mandate, obviously, in training students and scholars in methods and methodologies, making them aware of the traditional tools and models as well as the emerging ones in the context of changing dynamics of social science research and research in the human sciences. We are extremely privileged today to have amongst us one of the very well-renowned scholars, and himself a very active researcher in the field of social research and methodology, Professor Manfred Max Bergman. Was educated at the University of California, Geneva, and Cambridge, and held academic posts at Universities of Cambridge, Geneva, Michigan, and Basel. He currently holds the chair of social science research and methodology at the University of Basel, and is director of social transitions research group. He is research counselor at the Swiss National Science Foundation, vice president of its Committee on International Cooperation, and member of the Uganda National Academy of Sciences and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a UN initiative. His substantive research focuses on socio-sustainable transitions. As part of the research program Proof of Transitions Concept Protract, he and his team explore positive, real-world examples of sustainability transitions that bring together diverse stakeholders to cooperate towards positive, often serendipitous outcomes. He has taught advanced social science research methods across the globe. Methodologically, he is currently working on expanding mixed methods research and designs, and on exploring the rigor and boundaries of case study research. His research activities are currently located in Europe, India, and Singapore. But before you begin, Max, I think Aditi has to say something. Yeah.
Namaskar and a very warm welcome to all. I, Dr. Aditi Bapte, on behalf of ICSSR, welcome you to a talk on Beyond Qualitative and Quantitative Methods, Reflections on the Future of Social Science Research Designs and Methods, by the very renowned, as formally introduced by our Member Secretary, Professor Dhananjay Singh, our very renowned Professor Manfred Max Bergman. As Sir has already told, he is the Professor and Chair of Social Research and Methodology in the Department of Social Sciences, University of Basel, Switzerland. But before listening to your enriching talk, may I request our Member Secretary to please welcome Professor Bergman with a bouquet of flowers.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Okay. I am so very impressed to see so many people here, not only on a Saturday evening, but on a day that actually is following on a national holiday. So you honor me. I am so very impressed. I also know from some of the exchanges that I've had with some of you on LinkedIn that many of you are tremendously advanced and should actually co-teach this meeting with me. And so for those of you who already know some of the things very well, please be patient. I hope I will move on to also some subjects that you may know a little bit less well. And then, of course, we have the other group who may actually not be so experienced in research methods, where some of the things may actually go too fast. But please do stop me or slow me down if you feel that I go too fast, or if there are any other problems that you see with my presentation. Okay, if we could maybe, do I do that? No, not yet. If we could move to the first slide.
Pushkar.
So sorry.
Wonderful. Okay. So I will be talking about beyond qual and quan, because for a very long time, and maybe not as long as many of you are aware of, for since approximately the 1980s, the world of research methods has split into qual and quan. It doesn't mean that we didn't have qual and quan before, but approximately from the 1980s, there was kind of a division of labor where the two groups completely split. And we nowadays talk about different paradigms, and we talk about a paradigm war between qual and quan. And this is very dysfunctional. This is actually quite problematic in many, many different ways. So I don't want to take away from the statisticians in this room, and I don't want to take away from the ethnographers in this room, but a lot of the things that we believe is true about qual versus quan actually prevents the social sciences from not only collaborating, but actually to break some of the things that we have established in the 1980s internationally. So wherever I teach, whether it is in Japan or India or Australia or the US, it's always the same thing. It's the qual versus the quan, and we have our little phrases about quantitative is objective and qualitative is subjective or interpretive. And I think we're a little bit stuck. And it's our own doing. So let me actually talk a little bit about research methods beyond the qual and the quan, to reflect on some future science research methods, research designs, and where I think, especially I believe, India is going to play a very important role. I don't think this works. So could you do the next slide, please? Okay, yeah. All right, okay. Okay, so I've looked at training opportunities, and this is not a thorough research about the Indian landscape, and I was actually pleased and maybe a little surprised that the Indian landscape on social science research methods is quite similar to most other countries that I'm aware of. So we have, of course, introductory courses that give overviews of research design, and then introductions to quali and quanti business as usual, something that we've actually done for so many years that we're not even really reflecting that carefully about anymore what we're teaching. It just has become an automatism. So what we teach in our courses has been taught when we studied, has been probably taught to some extent with the people who have taught us when they were students. We certainly see a lot of quantitative methods, and today I'm not going to spend too much time on especially the quantitative part, because you have excellent, outstanding statisticians in this country, so there's no point for me to talk to you about sort of the cutting edge in statistics. There's probably people in this room or online who are much better suited to actually talk about this. But the other remarkable thing about statistics here is, again, I see very similar structures to everywhere else in the room, whether this is at the University of Chicago or Michigan in the US or in South Africa, very similar kind of course structures. The one thing that always has been surprising me for many years is that we're good and we're getting better and better in very high level statistics. So our analytics become so complicated that if you get into the cutting edge of statistics, you're starting to need to actually have a mathematics degree in order to be able to get into a top journal with a quantitative article in the social sciences. What I see as a major problem, however, in the quantitative sciences is that we have neglected for decades looking actually at what are we analyzing. So we're actually using these incredible, amazingly sophisticated tools of analysis. And I have to say, much of the data that we're using to analyze tend to be very poor. So our advancement of actually developing and thinking more carefully about good data compared to what we're actually doing with the data is there's a surprising gap. So when we design our surveys, we can do that. In the worst case, we pick something that the Americans have done in the 70s, and you see, okay, well, this is an established scale, so this must be valid also in India. I don't want to pick on the American. We can talk about Australians or the Brits and so on. So there is very often also in psychology and political science, sociology, this trend of just taking an existing scale, and I'm not talking about Indians, I talk about my experience in all other countries, or we develop our own instruments, and the kind of effort that we put into developing, let us say, a survey, in no way matches the skills that we actually apply to analyze this. So very often the surveys tend to be of relatively poor quality. Many of you are aware of sampling issues and so on. So huge effort in analysis, very relatively low effort in terms of instruments, and I think that should also make us pause, and I think future developments will actually go more in the direction of data quality. We're more and more focusing, and we're spending a lot of money on collecting data, and it will be more and more time to actually start to look at the quality of the data that we're collecting, especially because analyzing the data is not that expensive. I mean, there's people in the room who can do this maybe in a day or two, but the real price, the expensive thing, is actually generating the data. And if we have very poor data that ate up much of our budget, then we've actually lost a big opportunity here. Interestingly, in qualitative methods, a similar argument can actually be made. Because, again, there are courses on fieldwork, observational methods, ethnography, case studies, grounded theory, so participant action research. So also in India, these courses are very well represented. But what to do with non-numeric data is also not that very well represented. So what? So now you have interviews, or you have done observations, or you've been in the field for a month or 6. how are you going to now systematically analyze this? And with systematically, it could be quantitative, but certainly a systematic qualitative analysis is actually quite difficult, and people don't spend that much effort into it. So here, interestingly, the relationship is the opposite. So while in qualitative research we spend a lot of effort in actually collecting non-numeric data, our analytic capacities of what to do with the data once we have collected them tends to not be all that well developed. So these are the areas. This is like the more conventional thing where I think that we're going to continue to develop. So there's obviously going to be developments in statistics. There's going to be further developments in all kinds of ethnography and in all kinds of interview techniques and so on and so forth. But we need to actually now start to catch up, actually starting to collect good data for statistical analysis, and we need to learn to better analyze non-numeric data for our qualitative research. But that's still the conventional qual-quan part. Let me get into an area that becomes a little bit more complex. Let me start with the idea of case studies. So case studies has a very long history in anthropology, education, ethnography, business studies, history, political science, psychology, medicine, nursing, and so on and so forth. There are, if you look at the classical works of case studies, you clearly see a lot of Eurocentrism and a lot of ethnocentrism as part of them. So especially if you look at maybe classical case studies from the global north, you very clearly see how there's a certain cultural bias that reoccurs over and over again. The roots of modern case study research is in the Chicago School, and the reason why I will talk a little bit more about case studies is because I will close the circle toward the end by saying how case studies can actually become a very interesting new way of an old instrument that actually looks at phenomena that we are now encountering more and more in the social and related sciences, how they can actually be worked, how they can be reinvented, how they can be improved to at least address some of the shortcomings that we currently see, not only in case studies, but in qualitative and quantitative research more generally. So there's lots and lots of very famous books on case studies. That's sort of more or less, in terms of modern social sciences, this is kind of the beginnings. It's split very quickly, such that many people don't even realize that they're working on things that are based on case studies. So basically, the second generation, that was approximately until 1950s, you had the classical Chicago School case study splits then into, for instance, ethnography. It splits into grounded theory from the sociological perspective. So the Chicago School of Sociology then develops from it grounded theory and various other elements. In political science, that becomes quite interesting because George and Bennett or Gehring develop a quantitative approach to case studies, and they actually use prediction and causality as part of the case study approach. So here, in modern case study research, we're now talking about process tracing, pattern matching, time series analysis, Bayesian statistics is part of it. So there's a very sophisticated statistical component that looks at prediction and causality using case studies. So for those of you who are, many of us have been trained by being taught that case studies are qualitative research. That's actually not true. A case study can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, and it can be both. By the way, the same thing as interviews. So when I speak to my doctoral students and they say, I'm going to do an interview, I'm going to do interview research, then they will often assume that interviews are obviously qualitative. And that is not the case. And especially we for instance have computer-assisted, we're collecting survey data internationally using, for instance, computer-assisted interviews where that can be telephone interviews. That is sort of in the past what we're doing, maybe especially in contexts in not only in the global south, but for instance, the British household panel study uses actually personal interviews as a way to collect household panel data, which is analyzed statistically. So we need to break these lazy ways of thinking about methods. Well, case studies and interviews is qualitative and surveys is quantitative, because of course you can also do survey research with non-numeric data. But I won't talk too much about how to make qual and quan more sophisticated. I just wanted to point out in this context that in political science, case study now developed into an extremely sophisticated quantitative way of actually looking at cases for small groups of cases. And then in education, you have on the one hand the case study research that is used to evaluate schools or teachers, to evaluate curricula, and to evaluate education policy. And from education, it also developed into the Harvard method in business studies that is almost entirely based on case study research. So here you see just this thing of case studies starts to have many, many different developments. And of course, typically what we do, and maybe hopefully the future will actually improve on this, the social sciences don't even talk to each other, let alone to other fields. So the political scientists rarely talk to the ethnographers, rarely talk to the education people, and so on. And I'm almost sure that it's similar in India to most other places that I know of. Now, I mentioned very briefly, I don't have enough time to actually develop this in detail, but we have an incredible opportunity in the social sciences and the humanities for the 21st century. We are now confronted with issues around sustainability. We're confronted with very large transitions, and transitions can mean geoeconomic and geopolitical transitions, but these transitions are also intergenerational within every society. Transitions are also taking place in the way my mother, for instance, or your parents actually now think about certain issues may actually be very different from what they talked about 20 years ago. So we're talking about a lot of transitions that are taking place where the old methods don't really work that well anymore, because we're still using old methods with old theories and old assumptions. I'm not saying let's get rid of this historical work. Theories, and especially well-established theories, will continue to play a very important role, but we need to actually reflect more carefully about some of the approaches that we're using on social issues, for instance. Context and cultures. I remember I said that India is going to start to play a much more important role. Well, we know because of geoeconomic and geopolitical developments, India clearly has become front and center stage across all the domains within which I'm working. And I'm just going, I don't want to make this political, but I'm just going to drop two countries into this conversation for you to realize what I mean. And here the two countries are changes that are happening in China or with China, and changes that are happening with the US, which immediately puts India into a very different focus. And here, the idea of maybe needing to look, first of all, it really means that the social sciences are much more needed than maybe business as usual 20 or 30 years ago. But it also means that the social sciences haven't really caught up yet. And maybe the humanities also. I'd be very careful with that because I have a specialist next to me. But I think it is time for us to also become more aware of the absolute significance that we can play in terms of migration, sustainability, even technology development, even development of AI. Our knee-jerk reaction tends to be very critical, so we immediately criticize. So if something comes up, you know, IT, robotics, and so on, I mean, there are a lot of fears that we are being confronted with. Climate change, of course, you know, we just need to breathe in deeply to understand what I'm talking about. But there is a very important role that the social sciences and humanities can and should play, other than only critique. So I think starting to think about things in terms of case studies, a modern way of looking at case studies. And remember, I said case studies from a qualitative, quantitative, and a mixed methods way may actually be a really interesting way to start making important theoretical, empirical, but also practice-oriented contributions that are highly social science and humanities related. There are, of course, developments. I just want to very quickly mention these, sort of this, where I see the cutting edge of quantitative research. That would be experimental designs are becoming very interesting. For instance, to combine survey research with experiments. I'm sure also a number of people in this room are aware that now there's some really interesting way to do experimental survey research. Obviously, machine learning is going to play a much more important role. Natural language processing or big data analytics and advanced modeling are going to play a role. And here again, I think India can easily, and to some extent probably already is, at the forefront, because you not only have the talent, but the kind of data that you have, or that you could have, is mind-boggling compared to anything that I know that exists right now. So you also have the skills. Part of your national agenda is indeed to develop AI and to develop IT and technology and big data ability to deal with and to analyze and to do data analytics. So this is a great advantage that India potentially could have in actually becoming the leader in not only the social sciences. I can easily also see the health sciences as an element. We also see the digital humanities advancing very quickly. And so the technology advantage that you either have or that you will have shortly, considering the investment that India is doing into IT and technology, it would be a shame that the social sciences, in some sense, will not maybe contribute and actually be part of this, rather than only to be critics of technology. So there's an amazing stuff that you can do. I'm inventing this right now. It's for an apology. I'm probably saying something really terrible and silly and Eurocentric. But wouldn't it be amazing to actually think about the microbanking that actually is taking place in India and see to what extent microbanking, what kind of effect microbanking has to rural areas or to different social groups, and to actually do this in collaboration with institutes that I know exist. I've visited one in Bengaluru in March, who are sitting on incredible data from India and relating to India, and it almost screams for large-scale big data analytics where a social science participates, and not only medicine, and not only various other disciplines that by nature are already very good at big data. So in a number of different ways, I think India is very well positioned to lead in a number of different fields. And I also talked about the current trends in the new methods, so strong analytics and computer science, which currently outmatch, which these analytics still outmatch the kind of data that is being collected. And I think maybe a social science and a humanities voice could actually improve on the data that is being collected. With different subsections, you have so many different languages, so many different skill levels, and it demands social science and humanities to actually participate to get better quality data. The expansion possibilities from this quantitative part, of course, briefly mentioning mixed methods. So when I talk about mixed methods, that is basically one research design around one topical area that combines at least one qualitative and at least one quantitative component into the same design. I'll spend a little bit more time on mixed methods to show you some of the possibilities. But I also want to mention topic modeling. This is also, I'm not so sure, it's very difficult to present to you because I have no idea what your backgrounds are and what your skills, so I'm sure I'm going to do a lot of things wrong. But topic modeling basically means that you're starting to actually look at very large non-numeric data like tweets, they're still not called X's, or you're looking at newspaper articles, but not just a dozen, but you're looking at hundreds and maybe thousands and 10,000s. You can look at government documents, and you can actually do topic modeling by having a computer program actually analyze the content. Now, this would be a whole course about whether or not this is a good idea and what the limits of topic modeling are in comparison to a sophisticated kind of, for instance, a discourse analysis. But this is not something I want to get into right now. But topic modeling is something that is coming very, very fast, where we are starting to analyze, or it's actually, it's AI that is starting to identify text content. And I'm on the fence on this because I'm teaching a lot of qualitative research as well. So of course, you know, wanting to define qualitative research in itself, it does not for at least a few more decades. I can't imagine that it replaces it. But there's a lot of things that are happening in the quantitative analysis of non-numeric data that we shouldn't miss. We shouldn't miss the train. We shouldn't leave that up to the computer scientists. Let me tell you a little bit more about mixed methods. I'll tell you a little bit more about mixed methods. The idea of actually bringing two different elements together to enrich a social science analysis, and by extension, of course, various humanities would be included here, is not new. As a matter of fact, the social sciences have actually started as mixed methods, even though we didn't have the term for it. So when social scientists, well over 100 years ago by now, were interested in a phenomenon, they were observing, they may have actually talked with the people that they were observing, so there's like a quasi-interview that was part of it, there was a non-participant or a participant observation that was part of it, but then even people such as Malinowski would also start to count things and to analyze statistically. Well, not particularly sophisticated in the case of Malinowski, but the oldest form of social science was by nature mixed, because there wasn't it didn't really make sense at that time to say you're a quali and I'm a quanti, and people actually were very pragmatic and they were actually doing what was necessary. And this split basically came about from around the 1960s and 1970s, where both sides became very really developed into different subcategories. And interestingly, qualitative research started to embrace French social theory as a way to defend itself against the quantitative researchers who more and more started to embrace an objectivist position, the idea that the quantitative social sciences wants to be like the natural sciences. And of course, some of you in this room have studied the natural sciences, and you probably would at least snigger, if not laugh, if you think that the natural sciences operate the way the social sciences say they do. I just give you an example. Social sciences like to say that the natural sciences progress through the hypothetico-deductive model of science. So the only way to progress in science, according to many quantitative social sciences, is to have hypotheses, to test these hypotheses, to either reject or fail to reject a hypothesis. And only this way can you properly advance. But anyone in this room who does statistical modeling knows exactly this is not how we model. You know, we do not just run a model and then we report what we've seen and then that's that. No, we run our models how often? 20 times, 30 times, 100 times? Our graduate students run them 100 times for us. And then we pick one model and then we say that's the model that we hypothesized. We're not really cheating because everybody does it, so this is kind of a gentleman's and a gentlewoman's agreement where we just sort of look away. We still call this a hypothetical deductive model, but modern statistical modeling is quite far away from what was conceptualized as the hypothetico-deductive model. And then, of course, the natural sciences, they don't do the hypothetical-deductive models. Of course, they have some hypotheses, but where do you think the biologists and the chemists and the physicists come up with it? They're looking at an infinite number of data sets. So what kind of approach is that if you're looking at data and you're exploring structures and patterns in millions of data points? Well, that is not the hypothetical-deductive model. Crick and Watson did not have a fever dream where they said maybe DNA is structured, maybe is it a triangle, is it a circle, maybe it's a double helix. No, this was not developed as a hypothetical deductive model. This was exploration. This was looking at structures and patterns in the data, which nowadays in the social science we think incorrectly that that's what qualitative research does. So we have to modernize all of these very naive things that we are no longer really thinking about because we've been taught that in our course and somebody else taught that person. We have to start to become a little bit more sophisticated about what we do with data. So triangulation, basically you can triangulate different theories. So you can have, for different reasons, you can see, well, maybe this theory only gets me so far, and then there are certain elements that I'm no longer able to explain, but there's another theory that maybe actually starts to make sense in areas that the first theory doesn't work. So there's theory triangulation. There's data source triangulation. So data source triangulation can be, in a mixed methods framework, would for instance be that you conduct interviews and you can do surveys and you actually combine them. And there's many different reasons why you want to combine it. There's correct and incorrect ways, but I will not get into this. There's methods triangulation. You can have the same data set and you look at the same data set, whether it is quantitative or qualitative data, you can actually use different analytic methods. So from a statistical way, you could, for instance, run a factor analysis, you can extract the factor score and then use the factor scores subsequently in a regression analysis, or you can actually put all of what I just said together in a structural equation modeling where you can actually do both in the same step. In qualitative research, you can do, you can, for instance, do non-participant observations, and as part of your non-participant observation, you can actually do some either formal or less formal interviews to better understand what people are doing that you're observing. So this would be another form of methods triangulation. I won't go into investigative triangulation. That is more of a criterion for increasing reliability in interpretation, which is usually done in terms of qualitative analysis. Let me give you a very primitive example from mixed methods to explain to the quanties, on the one hand, why would you ever want to talk with qualitative researchers, and to explain to the qualies that you could actually make an important contribution to a quantitative analysis. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of the surveys that we're asking are either questions that we've always asked like that, so we're not actually spending too much time on worrying about what survey items we're actually going to use, and what may even be worse, we're using something because that has been established and everybody's publishing on those kinds of questions from the last 50 or 70 years. Well, let us assume that this is a researcher who actually wants to do a survey, but does not just want to ask questions that are around or whatever they have in their head. Let's actually say, let's actually make a more sophisticated study, because India is super complex. I mean, Delhi is super complex. I mean, the auto driver that I use every day is super complex. So we cannot assume that we are asking the right questions. We don't know what we don't know. That's the biggest problem with actually trying to interact with communities, with different ethnic groups, with other social groups, and so on. So instead of saying, okay, I come up with a survey and I just borrow questions here and there, why not actually design it? And so there's a huge literature on questionnaire design that is, especially in psychometrics, we have that very well established, and sociometrics also goes into this. But why not do some really interesting, a good set of interviews with members of your target group, where you can actually explore 4 different things. I hope I can improvise those 4. The first one is you want to learn the language. By the way, I just come yesterday from a conference, and the one thing that I was always frustrated about is that people said, oh, the poor people or the farmers, or that they don't know, we need to tell them, we need to tell them, we need to teach them, and so on. And the reason why I think this is frustrating is because I wonder to what extent people have actually spoken to them to better understand why they're doing things, quote unquote, wrong. So this is a really good example of saying, well, let's actually try to find out what is the right language to use with my target group. Of course, we scientists, you know, we've been so messed up by our education because we have all these fancy words and we have all these fancy theories and fancy words, and the worst thing that we can do, and I see that all the time, is that we put our fanciness into our questionnaire, into our question item. So we're basically showing how sophisticated we are and how much, you know, our parent support has paid off because the question asker is so good. But we very rarely actually try to figure out what is the language that we need to use to get at our target group. And this does not necessarily mean sort of middle and lower educated people. This could be bankers, this could be politicians, this could be consultants. What language does my target group speak that I need to actually embed in my items in this questionnaire? The second thing that I could do in these interviews that will actually develop this questionnaire would be to find out, well, what are the sensitive topics? So there's certain topics that are obvious for us. You know, there's certain things that, you know, like maybe politics and various other things. Caste could be something very sensitive to some, but there's other issues that are really difficult to see. Well, it's not sensitive to me, you know, but I shouldn't assume that it's equally not sensitive to you and vice versa. So the second thing that you can do with these exploratory interviews to prepare for a good survey is to look at sensitivity. The third thing that you can actually do with these interviews is actually part of these interviews is to look at the so-called dimensionality of the issue that you're looking at. So, for instance, you're interested in, let's go back to my terrible example earlier, a very naive example. How has microbanking affected, let us say, women in the countryside? That's what you want to do, in the countryside of a particular region. How has microbanking affected women in the countryside in a specific region? So if I had to design a questionnaire, of course I would speak to people from this region and they would give me all kinds of ideas, but how do you know that these are the right questions to ask? So looking at the dimensionality could be, for instance, if there's a team who has access to this community, who has some informal interviews with women in the countryside, to actually speak to them about microbanking, from which you then derive survey questions, which then, of course, you're very likely to ask face to face. So this would be a personal interview in order to collect the survey data. That would be in the second step. So, in other words, you look at the dimensionality that is relevant, because none of us, including insiders, I'm not so sure if insiders are good enough to actually outline the kinds of questions that we need to ask for a target group. I mean, in some sense, all of you in this room are insiders. Who of you should speak for everybody else if I wanted to do a survey with people in this room? Who is the expert about the opinions in this room? I don't think that this person probably exists. So looking at the dimensionality of the thing that you're interested in, whatever it is, justice, equality, or issues relating to poverty or childbirth, or who knows what, speaking to members of the target group will give you a much better idea of what to ask in the survey. And then finally, part of these interviews are fantastic background in order to better understand potential hypotheses. As soon as you get a really interesting hypothesis, where do they come from? They of course come from the literature, they come from your own imagination of what would be interesting to test in your survey, but you're likely to develop some interesting hypotheses based on the interviews that you've conducted. And so you can pack all of this into the survey, and the survey will be far, far better than spending maybe with 2 or 3 people from, as informants and coming up with a survey by itself. Of course, it takes a lot more time. But again, survey data tends to be so expensive. Why not actually go the extra qualitative step, which in comparison is usually cheaper than quantitative research, in order to improve the instruments? Okay, how much time do I have? Okay, all right, okay. 10 minutes, so...
No, you may speak as long as you want.
No. I'm already very grateful to be allowed in here, so... Okay, so let me give you now a little bit more of a sophisticated way of thinking about mixed methods, how qual and quan can collaborate with each other, and especially I'm going to use this in terms of an intervention, like a community intervention or interventions maybe in hospitals, also in healthcare and public health. There are many different ways that I can imagine interventions. Interventions with farmers about trying to improve farming techniques. So the first thing in a mixed methods environment of an intervention, of course, part of the intervention would be that you need a baseline. You basically need a pretest or a baseline that is going to serve you to see to what extent your intervention was effective or not. But how do you know what the right baseline is? How do you know what to measure in order to say, well, that's my baseline? So a really interesting way to create a much more context and culture sensitive way to understand what the baseline is, for example, to do some focus groups to develop this intervention and then to also have this baseline. So now you know much better about what the baseline should be, instead of just asking a silly professor like me, okay, well, what's the baseline for this community? Hopefully the honest expert will say, well, I don't know, let's actually talk to some people and let's do some observations, let's actually look at something before we say, okay, well, this is the baseline. I'm sorry, I haven't caught up with that. So the first step in an intervention is to actually be much more careful about deciding what the pretest or the baseline is. The second step would then be, of course, the intervention, but while the intervention runs, in some instances, you could also actually explore the narratives of the farmers as they're going through the intervention, or the nurses as they're actually being trained or being part of the program. You could also talk to the people who are running the intervention, the teachers or the experts or whoever, to see how are things going in order to learn better about the type or the quality of the intervention that is being run. So here again, the intervention in itself is one thing, and maybe a qualitative component that could be either narratives or diaries or just informal discussions with participants, with, for instance, farmers that you can visit occasionally to see, well, how is it going and what do you like, what you don't like, in order to better understand the process of the intervention. And then finally, of course, there's a post-test and a post-intervention that connects to what you actually developed in the first steps. But you can also talk about follow-up interviews with the communities that were part of the intervention, and you can also speak about follow-up interviews with people who actually conducted the intervention, the experts, the teachers, the whatever, the community leaders. And so this tends to be, of course, more time-consuming, more sophisticated, but you're not just saying, okay, let's just see how much people know, and then you run the intervention, and then you measure after the intervention, do they now know more or not? It gets into journals, but it's not enough to actually create impact. And so this would be just to show you in a more interesting way how you could actually set up methodologically an intervention that could be qualitatively much more suitable, again, for cultural and a contextual environment. The same idea can also, of course, be used for random controlled trials or for multi-phase research, for those of you who are more experimentally oriented. I will skip the next one. I want to talk maybe a little bit more about transdisciplinarity. So most of us are familiar with interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity. Transdisciplinarity is actually something quite different. It basically, in an ideal world, transdisciplinarity basically connects with external stakeholders, with relevant external stakeholders. So that could be politicians, that could be community leaders, that could be the community itself, where in the center of transdisciplinarity is co-development, co-design, and co-production of not only knowledge, but also of what to do, how to improve a situation. Co-develop impact. So the important thing here is that this is not separate from qual and quan. So whatever your intervention is very likely to still use conventional qualitative or quantitative research, but this is actually on top of what we do. The hardest thing to do TD, to do transdisciplinarity, is that experts can't help but imposing themselves. So I've heard in many contexts, also in the Indian context and in many other contexts, this is like old stuff. Yeah, we actually include our stakeholders, but how do you include them? Do you just invite, some politicians or some community leaders, and then you tell them what you're going to do, and then they just nod, and then that was it? That's not TD. So there are fantastic examples. I won't have time to get into the details of all of this, because all of them can actually be a whole lecture in its own right. But the idea is to actually set the agenda together. So it's not the researcher who decides what a community needs, or the expert who decides what the farmers need to know. It is actually co-developed with the farmers, with the nurses. You interact with the stakeholders, so you're not just telling them, but you actually interact with them. You clarify responsibilities, you actually make them team members. You account for the beneficiaries. You actually say who is going to benefit, who's the beneficiary. You're going to promote mutual learning, you enhance the capacity, so a very important part is also to bring people along. So it's not just the expert from Europe, but the expert, there's also lots of experts in India, needs to bring people along, not only in terms of the stakeholders, but maybe somebody from the community can actually be part of the core research team, because they can actually then continue the process when the research team actually leaves. Sharing data and sharing networks is important. Dissemination of the results is very important. Also, how do you disseminate? Do you just publish in the American Journal of whatever, which may or may not be useful to some people, or do you think of more original or interesting ways to actually share your findings? We all are now in the habit to say, yeah, our research has policy relevance, and we're going to send our article, our scientific article, to the minister, and guess what happens with that? And this is not the fault of the minister, by the way, but that's a different discussion. Of course, everything else is their fault. I'm kidding. So the important is also to think about how to disseminate what kind of information. We lost. You need to also pool the profits and the merits. So it's not just the researcher who then gets to publish, or you need to also think of ways of how to pool the benefits of this project. You need to also worry about the how to apply it. So finishing this research is not the end of TD. Also, you have to worry about the application of it. And then finally, you need to secure the results. You need to make sure that, let us say, if the community leader actually changes, then there is still something left after that person leaves. So how to actually secure outcomes is another important component of TD. I found a wonderful way how participatory. This is I don't know to what extent this is well known in India, but I found a wonderful example of elements of TD in participatory rural appraisal, PRA. And I really like that very much. The idea is there's a very well developed history of PRA and established practices of bottom-up participant-led research. The current trend in TD, however, is that it's still the researcher that is kind of running the show. They're kind of, maybe they try to speak to people who participate and then gets frustrated because they don't understand the theories or the sophisticated methodological mumbo jumbo, and so in the end we just invite them for coffee and tea and we inform them what we're doing, and that was that. That's not TD, that's something very different. So that is still, unfortunately, still the trend, is that we still think too much of ourselves as experts, and the more expert you are, well, maybe not you, but in my world, the more professor somebody is, the more they lost the ability to listen. So most high-level professors already know the answer. They don't even have to do the research. They already know what's going to happen. That this community needs that, and the farmers have to do this, and the hospital needs to do this. And then we, of course, need money, and we do the thing that we do, but we kind of already know what's going to come out. And that's not a good way to actually do this. So TD in general, and then PRA is a really good way to actually collaborate much closer. And I found some wonderful pictures. I mean, do look up, for those of you who don't know it, PRA, because there's some wonderful examples. I mean, the picture, the picture at the bottom left that you see is a fantastic way of how actually a community makes sense of the environment, the lived environment within which they are, and the less the expert and the professor tells them about inequality and location of housing and so on, and the more this is co-developed, the more the people that you're working with actually make sense on their own way, and the greater the possibility of your own learning in this sense. So I know I'm running out of time, so let me see. Let me tell you a little bit about positive case studies. This is a passion of mine, because I have become, about a decade ago, a little bit frustrated about the quite successful research that we've done in our team. We know how to write applications to get money. We address a social problem because that's what we do as social scientists, and sometimes we get the money, most of the time we don't. It's never enough money. I've never met a researcher who ever says, okay, this is enough money. And then, of course, we do the research, and we find that women are disadvantaged, and we find that social groups have different access. We find that different groups have different access to the labor market, to educational opportunities, to this and that. And then we're all upset about this in a proper social science way. And we then make recommendations. The government has to do this, the corporations need to do this, and so on and so forth. I mean, and this is kind of, this fills papers, this gets our research done. And as we speak right now, there's probably maybe 5,000 PhDs that are currently written about the unequal access of women into the labor market, as we speak right now. And so my question was, 10 years ago, how many more PhDs and how many more projects do we need to write in order to show how unfair the world is with regard to, and then you fill in the blank, gender, disability, and so on and so forth. And I said, I don't want to take away from that. This is very important for 100 reasons. But how often do we need a social science to tell the government that resources are unequally distributed, companies need to change their hiring practices, and so on and so on. So I thought, is there a way that I can work on as a social scientist that it doesn't improve on the dominant model, but is there something interesting that I can do instead of doing the same thing over and over again? And so what we started to think about is actually surprisingly positive cases. And a positive case, how do I know if it's a positive case? Well, we're basically looking at groups or organizations or institutions or communities that are engaging in something that are surprisingly successful. Why surprisingly? Because often they're not funded by the government or some international or national fund, that have an incredible impact on something. And the idea was actually, let's study those. Let's study how can they exist for a longer period. We sometimes call them tide pools because they're not there permanent. They appear and they exist hopefully for a long time, and then something happens and then it disappear. But let's actually study how do different stakeholders with very different motivations come together to actually work on something together to create something that is bigger than the sum of their contributions. So serendipity is something very important for us. Serendipity, basically, with that we mean that it's almost the opposite of greenwashing. Yeah, greenwashing is when you say that you're actually doing something good for the environment or for a community, but you're just using it as a label for whether it's a company or whether it's an NGO and so on and so forth. Serendipity is when somebody says, no, we're a restaurant or we are a market. But what actually happens is that they're not just selling fruit and vegetables, they're actually giving jobs. And not only the jobs to the people who work in the market, but all the restaurants that are around there, all the different businesses that profit, all the autos and the taxis that actually bring people back and forth, all the infrastructure that needs to be maintained in order to have this market, all the vendors and maybe the farmers from which who are actually bringing these products to the market. So this is an example. We've actually done a study on the eastern market of Detroit. On paper, it's a fruit and vegetable market, but it is so powerful that the city of Detroit actually has built its infrastructure, including drainage system for floods and various other aspects, and their housing programs are developed around this eastern market. It's truly amazing, and this is an example of a positive case. But a positive case can be something as small as another study that we've done is a bicycle shop that doesn't really take your money if you don't have any. So of course, they charge you if you have money, but if there's somebody who needs something, but their favorite thing is to actually teach the person how to fix their own bike. And this has become such a focus as a community center that young people just start to hang out. They just go there to socialize. And then suddenly there's a cafe and a restaurant that opened across the street because it's such a nice hangout. And so all they do is fix bicycles and fix used bicycles for very little money, but it has actually become an anchor for the community. And India is actually full of these surprising positive cases. Again, we don't have time to actually get into the positive cases that I've seen. Oops. So, and the nice thing about these cases is you don't necessarily have to make recommendations what government has to do or NGOs have to do. You actually see the positive solution. You need to just try to understand, how does it work? Now, all of you are probably familiar, one of the biggest problems with case studies, of course, is upscaling, is generalization. But we should, this is another area in research methods that we should start to think a little bit more careful about. How many humans do you need to study in order to understand, for instance, the function of a liver? Do you need a large representative study to do that? Well, no, of course not. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying all livers are adequate. So an N of 1, but most of the time an N of 1 is enough. Not only that, but these cases do not necessarily have to be replicated exactly from one environment to another, but you can say, look, there's something really interesting that this company does in this community in order to keep their workers. Well, it wouldn't make sense to perfectly replicate what they have actually done, but there are certain ideas that can be translated and still work in a different context. So this is about the somewhat lazy arguments against case studies that we can unpack, because there's a lot more than we can do with case studies. than to say that to say, well, this may be true for this time and this context, but it's not true for anything else. I mean, we're still talking about the Chicago School, even though they've only studied in the 1920s Chicago, and is still to some extent, in some areas, still relevant. So this is just one of the examples of how we can learn, even from cases. And it's important to do cases in India, is because just bringing the social sciences from the global north to India is probably relatively easy. You may get funding, you may get into journals, but it may not be suitable for this context. And so this is these systematic cases that are by nature context sensitive and culture sensitive can actually make a contribution that goes well beyond just a published case study. But you can say, no, at least in this case, I know that India takes different than what we know from this theory or from this approach. So I'm going to skip in order to, let's see, where do we go? Yeah, I want to actually finish. Oh, doesn't seem to work anymore. Whoever has power over this, can you skip to slide 15? So I'm 3 to 5 minutes, I'm finished.
आप कर दो.
Oh, now it works again. Okay, sorry, now it works again. Okay. I think one of the most interesting things that sort of straddles the idea of methods and other things that are part of our social sciences is to go, right now we kind of have a split world, the empirical world on the one hand, and then sort of a critique world on the other hand. And the critique world very much draws from constructivism, post-colonial critique, and so on. Nothing wrong with it. Again, it fills journals, and however, I would always, in a global south context, I will always say post-colonial critique is very important, but look very carefully where it is being taught and who teaches it, because part of post-colonial critique could be another form of colonialism. So it is a fantastically important contribution to start to question things. And maybe I'm a little bit biased also because I do a lot of qualitative and quantitative research, so I'm more of an empiricist, but I'm saying, okay, critique is great. I've never seen a study that I cannot instantly destroy as a reviewer, but what do we do with it then? What's sort of the next step? And a really important contribution, and now I go back to how important it would be for India to actually move in this direction for everybody, would actually go beyond the idea of, well, it's your construction versus my construction, and we're just coming from different cultures, and so isn't it interesting? Is to actually go more systematically into looking at the constructs that we are or we should be looking at the context within which these constructs are embedded, looking at the cultural space in which the context and constructs are. And of course, for those of us who want to actually have an impact, although I wouldn't argue that social science by definition should have one, but for those of you who want to have an impact, impact for what? And so my favorite, of course, a really good example is to actually look at the idea of poverty. And most economists know exactly how to define poverty. There's a poverty line, it's X, depending if you look at the SDGs, poverty means $1 per day, and so a wonderful contribution is, as an example of the idea of where we need to go, is to look at Amartya Sen's understanding on poverty as capability deprivation. So here we're talking, there's a beautiful citation that I want to read in order to try to make the point of starting to even be much more careful of what we say we want to study. So in terms of poverty, it says human beings are thoroughly diverse. You cannot draw a poverty line and then apply it across the board to everyone the same way, without taking into account personal characteristics and circumstances. And then, of course, his tremendous work in this area would include would include the geography within which you're, and we're not just talking about India, but India has so many geographies, it's a whole continent in itself. Community, education, skills, status, access, health status, justice, credit, outlook, so the ability to get credit has a lot to do with poverty. And so I'm not saying that everything has to be super complicated, but I'm saying that whatever decision we do in terms of this is what we want to study, let's actually reflect a little bit about how relevant it is for our geographic space, but also for the time within which we're living. And things are being reinvented right and left, and I think social sciences need to be part of this movement. I'm ending with a slide by saying, I read in this month's Lancet, which is the oldest and one of the most respected medical journals, I read the following: shifting power in global health will require leadership by the global south and allyship by the global north. And this, of course, is particularly relevant for India, but it goes very, very well beyond health. And so this is really the kind of mindset that we need to develop. And so I think I'm looking at pollution, I'm looking at political conflict, I'm looking at technical development in all its form, positive and negative, and it screams for a contribution by the social sciences. I'm saying, where are they? Where are we? You know, we need to be more present, and then of course, for better or worse, for many, and this would be the topic for a different discussion, the Global South generally, which I think is a terrible label that doesn't really work anymore, but that's again another lecture, and India especially is incredibly well positioned. So I can't wait to hear a lot more about this. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Max. It's been an hour of most delight and education, and also reiteration of concerns that we have in India, especially when it comes to research methods and methodology that evolve out of different contexts. And you mentioned Eurocentrism, and perhaps the need not only to decolonize research methods and methodology, but also to be aware of the fact that that impose different constructs on varying social realities that India present. This is something which we are conscious about, and we have been wanting to address this issue. And thank you so much for making it so comprehensive. You started by saying that you skip quantitative and focus on qualitative and next, but in fact you, in a very well, in a wonderful way, you in fact integrated limitations of the two and the third. And with regard to case studies, your point on post-colonialism and coming from literary studies. Thomas King, the Canadian writer, of course, has an essay called Godzilla versus the Post-Colonial, where he emphasizes the fact that the substantive colonial is the one that, in fact, drives the post-colonial. That we need to be extremely skeptical of these categories and constructs. Whenever we give a call for projects at ICSSR, especially projects which are either theme-based or projects that in fact want our researchers to solve certain, let's say, societal problems and challenges, whether it is about tribal communities, whether it's water that we've just recently, or sustainability and solar energy, or for instance studies that are seem more traditional, but they evolve newer problems. I think one has to really give emphasis and importance to the context as such, to various, as I said, differences that exist among communities, obviously. And this is just to say a few things with a lot of in-depth kind of discourse that we've heard. And also this applies as well with literary studies. I had some students from Jawaharlal Nehru University, from PhD students from literary studies. When we actually read and study literary cultural text, again, the very decision to include a textual analysis based study or a theoretical study and then go and read perhaps the voices in the text that speak out of different social contexts. So we have to really sometimes make choices, obviously, and our choices depend on so many factors that we need to be quite aware as researcher when you are designing the research plan and or when we are carrying out the investigations. So thank you so much, and we have colleagues from my university, JNU, and other institutes here from Delhi University, and we have 200 participants joining us on WebEx apart from the YouTube Live. So I'm sure I must not take time and give it to them, and I'm so grateful to each one of you. I must tell you that you found time and they've come here. So now let us move towards the discussion and then in Q&A, and if you could, so we'll take first questions and observation comments, very brief, from colleagues who are here, and then as well take some questions and observations from those who have joined online. And depending on the patience of Max, I'm sure he's quite doesn't look tired at all, but in the sense it's been a long
I give you until 1 a.m.
Yeah, that's so kind of you to say so. So let us take some questions, and you please introduce yourself briefly, and please be brief in your questions. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, Professor, I'm Ramesh Talia, Professor of Economics in JNU. Nothing, I appreciate your knowledge, on status of social science research in India. You rightly point out many issues. One is especially PRA. In the Indian context, it work a lot. For Indian context, PRA is a beautiful concept. But 15 years back, it was very popular. But now we are not speaking much about PRA. And your young generation also, they are more on quantitative research. Is one thing. And second one, lack of interaction among social scientists. For example, a mental well-being, to study about mental well-being, we need the association of economists, sociologists, and psychologists. So that is not taking place.
Yeah.
That's not taking place. Then third point I observed is failure of social science research is bad data. These things. And in the Indian context, is very much required is observation methods. Because of various stages, stability, income condition, social condition, community-wise, and more people living in rural areas. So we need to study about on the basis of observation methods. And that's all. Just my observation I made on these things.
Yeah.
I think prioritizing observation method, PRA, and we may develop good research in Indian context.
Would you take some questions?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Okay. So we will take a few questions, maybe 4 or 5, and so Sunita ji and then Madhav ji. Yeah, Sunita, kindly introduce yourself.
Interesting and very well about the qual and division earlier, and now more and more of these methods which researchers are trying to address. I'm Sunita Reddy. I teach next door in Jawaharlal University. I'm an anthropologist. My way of working is more ethnography, and I teach public health. And many of our colleagues feel that we don't really need to do quantitative study. We can just hire a statistician. But that's not true, because I feel we also need to understand the tools and the methods and statistics to make a real analysis of the data. Secondly, I have seen that abroad, more of teams from various disciplines work together, especially to solve many kind of social issues. So I feel that is a much better way, because for any social issue, it's not just an anthropologist, but sociologists, economists, psychologists, and even IT people should be there together to come up with some good solutions. The third important point which I would like to maybe say is that there might be dialogue between the academicians and the policymakers.
5 to 6
That's where I feel a lot of research which goes in for 5 years or 10 years, even the policy briefs are not really asked from the academicians. And bureaucrats are so busy that they won't be able to read the thesis. And in fact, Dhananjay, I think earlier also discussed that we do so much of research from UGC and ICSSR. The executive summaries can be sent to the, to the ministries, concerned ministries, so that at least they know that who's doing what kind of research. If they are interested, they can call those researchers for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for giving a very nice.
From Anna University, I'm very happy to join in you in this conference on learning the research methodology. And I'm very much thankful to the ICSSR for organizing such it was a very nice online program. That will be very much useful to our young researchers. So that to give the opportunity to share the views of the senior researchers to for strengthening the reviewed research, reviewed studies, the field of social sciences. I am also thankful, first of all, my gratefulness to the ICSR to incorporate the rural studies as one of the main subjects of the list of subjects of government for the social science research project from this year onwards. I am very much thankful to the authority of ICSR and they are thankful to the government of India to incorporate the
Sir, if you could ask your question and if you could be brief, because
my question and some supplements related to even talk on quantitative and qualitative research method.
That's one good question.
What is
सर मैं सर टॉक में हूँ सर हेलो सर आप हैं अभी अच्छा हाँ हाँ जी सर हाँ मैं जी बिल्कुल सर अच्छा अच्छा ओहो अच्छा जी सर सॉरी सर हाँ सर ओके श्योर श्योर जी जी सर थैंक यू सर थैंक यू
In this direction, what is your good idea and your opinion and your suggestion
Sir, I think we've got a drift of your comment and a question. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Sir, I have two questions. I need two observations.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. So kind of you.
Two observations. One, very rightly you said that the quality of research depends upon quality of data. And you mentioned many things that how to collect the good quality of data. One of the methods that you suggested is that instead of talking to the experts, we should talk to the common people to get the better data. So here I think that we need to talk to both kind of, because we require different kinds of data. When we require behavioral kind of data, then we talk to the individuals. For example, do you take dowry in your marriage? Yes or no, why kind of things. But why do people in this area take dowry? Probably that person may not be knowing. So we require the cultural expert in those areas, why they are doing, one thing. Second thing, sir, you talk about the studying the positive cases. How many sociologists are how many social scientists we need to tell that there is a discrimination and kind of thing. So it is already established, something we should go for positive. Sir, can you tell me any case anywhere where the government collapses, then there is an inquiry center. When train collided, there is an inquiry center. Thousands of trains are running successfully, no research is conducted that why they are running. millions of marriages are successful generation after generations. No research is done why they are successful. Yes, there are research why they fail. So why I'm telling this thing, my background is science studies, social studies of science. So we raise this kind of question.
Shweta, I'm working currently with National Institute of Bank Management.
Yes, please, go ahead. क्या हुआ? I think
आपको म्यूट कर दीजिए, अभी अंदर का कर लीजिए.
अच्छा. So we'll take these questions and then we go online. Then next.
Okay, let's do these Let's do these three and then go back to the person who just started to ask the question.
We'll ask the online participants.
Okay, you said that PRE came and went, and there's a lack of interaction, especially I would say between the social sciences. And this is one of the things that frustrates me the most, because why do computer scientists and biologists can work together? Why can physicists and chemists work together? Why can a statistician or a mathematician work with a biologist, but we can't manage? You know, are you telling me that we are more complicated or we are more special? It's very much in most, not all, but most sciences are very much focused on outcomes, but somehow we are in competition with each other. And it's not just between, if I understand correctly, to the right we have one university and to the left we have the other university. We are also in competition with our colleagues within the department. And as I have no idea who's online, hopefully not too many of my colleagues, but unfortunately there's no incentive that I see for us to cooperate. You know, and this is one of the biggest problems. So while we say we're interested in health, and we're interested in poverty reduction, and we're interested in the social effects, and I don't believe that as persons in our heart we deeply are committed, but there's no way I'm going to work with them, or her, or him, because they don't understand my theory, or they do something else. And that really frustrates me, you know, because the natural sciences have the same conflicts, but they do not actually bring these conflicts into the public. They say, okay, well, we disagree, but let's actually, for now, for this 3-year project, let's collaborate together. The universities or the different researchers from disciplines. So I think it's something of our own making. This is not about theory or methods. This is something that we design because I believe that we don't have enough incentive to collaborate. Our job, our salary does not depend on that. And I think maybe in the sciences it is a little bit different than for us. So I wrote an article a few years ago about the fashions and conventions of methods. So even though we talk about methods as if it is, as if this has something to do with objectivity or appropriateness. I mean, all research books that I know would argue that choose the methods that is suitable for your research question. That is such a hollow phrase, because I would give one single research question to this room and you will come up with 100 different designs. There is no such thing as the method for that question. So we are far more flexible to decide, oh, this is multi-level modeling, or this is Markov chain modeling, oh, this is discourse analysis, oh, this is qualitative content analysis. We can do this, and so I don't know to what, I mean, on the one hand this is great because we can sort of use our own skills. On the other hand, it's not so good because it makes it very difficult to actually come together. There's a lot about fashions and conventions, about methods, that while we talk about objectivity or suitability or quality, very often it's also very much habit. There's a beautiful metaphor that you're aware of that says you show somebody how to use a hammer and suddenly everything looks like a nail. And that's a little bit like that. It takes so long to actually get at a higher level of structural equation modeling or a Foucauldian discourse analysis that I don't want to unlearn this in order to actually do something else. And so I understand for maybe a higher level theoretical approach, or maybe you're not so interested in impact that you should do that. But especially if you're impact oriented, I think that should give people and researchers much more motivation to collaborate. And bad data, I mean, you're absolutely right. Bad data is constantly a problem, and the quanties can say, well, that's all we have. That's what we're stuck with. This is the data that we have. So we may admit that publicly, or we may just keep it privately. But in the end, our coefficient is still the objective truth. In qualitative research, it's the same thing. I mean, we do super complicated, for instance, Foucauldian discourse analysis, but we're based on 20 interviews that we've done over one weekend, that our assistants have done. We don't even know exactly how these data came about. So I'm exaggerating, of course. We're more sophisticated, but I think very often data, we're not necessarily being either rewarded for collecting careful data. We tend to be more rewarded in terms of sophisticated analysis. So if I can name drop, for instance, how my GFIs, my goodness of fit indicators, are actually above 0.97, then that sounds very scientific, If I tell you that I have studied the discursive strategies that are part of the discursive environment within a particular public discourse, then I sound like I know what I'm talking about. And that, unfortunately, kind of drives us. But, the data is really expensive and really hard to collect if it's high quality. So we need to sort of address these things beyond sort of this professional element. I'm going to try to be quicker. You have to want to collaborate. It doesn't work to say, okay, well, why don't you collaborate? That doesn't make any sense, because you're an economist and you're an ethnographer. Why should you have your theories, you have your budgets, you have your topics, and so on. But if I were to tell you, there is a particular health issue that you are looking at that is unique to this environment, or that is new, that hasn't been really covered. And so the first thing that you need to do is to study this properly in its ethnographic richness. But once we have done that, I'm not saying that ethnography needs quantitative, but once I've done that, you could decide, okay, now let's see to what extent what I've discovered is actually more typical around a larger subpopulation. Then you need an economist. And I totally agree with you. Just hiring a statistician doesn't work, because the qualitative researcher doesn't know the language of statistics to say this is what I need. And the quantitative researcher, they know the methods, but they don't know what you want from them. So there's an a priori translation problem between them. So hiring, or having, most universities have a local statistician, and what you do, you give them the variables and they just give you some univariate, bivariate stuff. Maybe if you're lucky, they say, oh, I think you should look at this, and then comes up with something. But it's very rarely along the lines of what you had in mind. And so there's a fundamental interpretation problem. So ideally, there should be a team, maybe a quali and a quanti, who say, let's work together to look at this issue. And that means both have to bend. And we don't bend well once we have tenure and beyond that. But both have to bend in the sense that the quali needs to now adapt to the limits of a statistical analysis and does proper ethnographic work, but along the lines that the statistician can use to say, and now I can help you. And then, of course, vice versa. The statistician, I mean, it's usually, in my experience, harder for a statistician to listen to a qualitative person than vice versa, but maybe it's different here. The statistician also says, no, I can't just start my models. I actually now need to try to listen, okay, what have you found, and how can that be translated into measurements that then can be used to look at relations between indicators. but it has to be developed from the beginning. It cannot be, okay, here's my data, do something with it. I also agree. I mean, I didn't really say that we need to talk about to the common people. That was your expression. I'm saying that when we develop instruments, when we are addressing an issue, we have to talk to the people that we're trying to address, and that can be government ministers, that can be hospital directors. So we shouldn't think that because of our education and our sophistication, we already know what the right question is. We may have a good hunch because we spent a lot of time, but a certain humbleness to actually sit and listen and maybe sit in conferences or sit in business meetings to better understand the environment can actually help us create better instruments. In the end, secondly, I fully agree with you. It's not really the target group that should tell us how to interpret our statistical model, for instance. So I'm not a big fan of member checks, of the idea that once I've done a study, I have to now ask you whether you are agreeing with my interpretation. I certainly would hope to speak with you about it, but your disagreement could be because we may actually don't share the same ideological position or the same theoretical position. Maybe you don't know the theories that I apply, so you have a different opinion. So just because opinions diverge does not necessarily mean that the researcher automatically has to adapt. So I think sometimes people over-interpret. You're going to show to your target group about how prejudiced they are, and they're not going to agree with you. Most people don't agree with you. Surprisingly, I've done a study like that in Texas, and I was very surprised how people actually agreed that they were prejudiced. But that's very rarely the case. So I agree with you that this is not a question of them telling us. But when we talk about transdisciplinarity, you can do as many studies as you want about what farmers should do, what communities should think. It's rarely going to work well. And many times, sometimes our ideas are good, but they're not accepted because we're using the wrong communication vehicle. We're just telling them what to do, and they say, well, who are you to do that? And sometimes our ideas are bad because we don't understand the reality on the ground. And this is why sometimes it's actually very important, even as a sophisticated, even as an economist, to speak to people on the ground.
Thank you. So just to add to what you said, this year, and as some of you might be aware, that we made it important, in fact mandatory, I don't want to call it mandatory, that the research project proposals has to be collaborative, especially in areas that actually require collaboration, like AI and women employment, for instance, or health studies, social health. We made it mandatory that we will accept proposals only that are collaborative, and also we made it important that the collaboration should be across geographies. So the 250 odd projects that we actually funded, we had social health being studied, based on, let's say, 5,000 sample from Assam and Kerala. So, and then across geographies. So that's a wonderful point that you've made. Thank you so much. And we're short of time. And
Sir, I have a question.
yes, Professor Dr. Saha. So what we'll do is, in order to manage the time well, we'll take Dr. Saha's question, and then we can ask some of our students here. So I think we should give them an opportunity. Students and research assistants we have here to ask questions, and then we go for the third round. So I think since we had qualitative, quantitative mix, so we'll go for third. Perfect. 3 sets of questions, and I'm sure there are many questions awaiting. In fact, next time, if I request you to have an interactive session,
absolutely,
with our researchers.
So can I go ahead?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'm Dr. Mahashweta, currently working as an assistant professor in NIT Pune, and it was a wonderful, wonderful lecture by Professor Bergman. Thank you, sir, for such wonderful insights. I'm primarily in mixed method. I have done some studies on qualitative and quantitative. So my question, I have two questions in specific. One is that you have given an example of working in rural India and of microbanking on specific women particularly, and you have said that we will be going ahead with informal interview with ladies and derive a questionnaire. That is primarily we are talking and then deriving a questionnaire. However, in management research, I am a management professional, academician. What we generally do is we go for a standard questionnaire based on the developed variables and we adapt the variables based on our requirement. However, I feel it questions our originality, where we need to develop a questionnaire based on the ground reality, like you said, informal interview with ladies. But then if we go ahead with those kind of research, then scale development is a bigger process and work in itself. And many of the journals, many of the A category journals, they don't accept developing a scale, and it takes a long time to validate and reliability, validity and everything of the scale. So how to go ahead with that? That is my first question. And second question, to be very precise, I would like to know that what would be scope in specific in near years for means in future years, that what could be the scope of management research?
These are the primary questions.
Of course, it comes under social science research. However, particularly in specific, what will be more evolving areas in management
both
research?
are asked by the same
person. Thank you so much.
So now may I request some students here can ask, and the research assistants, if you could. Yeah, please introduce yourself and
thank you so much, sir. I'm Pavitra Saha. I'm a research scholar at here. So I'm a research scholar at NEPA, National Institute of Educational Planning and Business in Delhi. So, sir, I have questions that I'm working on teacher policy, teacher quality, and teacher leadership towards students' outcomes. So, I was thinking about that. How do we understand the coherence and quality between research methods and research areas where validity and reliability are like major concern?
Can you say the last thing again?
Yeah, validity and reliability are major concern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
yeah. So can you please just wait? आप थोड़ा सा म्यूट कर दीजिए. Sorry, म्यूट कर दीजिए. Yeah, Sonia. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. My name is Sonia Rana and I'm working here as a junior research consultant in ICSSR. My research work mainly revolves around the study of ethnic minorities. And the method that I primarily adopted was qualitative. During my research, I find it ethnically challenging to include ethnic minorities in my research design and yet ensure that I do not expose them to risk like deportation. For instance, during my postdoctoral research, I had to interview the Low Shenpa ethnic minorities in Bhutan, and I wanted to know their experiences in the current monarchical regime. However, they were reluctant to share their experiences to me given their history of mass exile. So while my research would be incomplete without knowing their experiences, but at the same time, I wanted to ensure that I don't give them the burden of my research. So how does one deal with such an inner conflict that I often face during my research work with ethnic minorities?
I just have a tiny clarification to ask. My name is Anuradha. I teach political science at Delhi University.
Yeah, please complete your question. Yeah.
I teach political science at Delhi University, and you spoke something about topic modeling. Is topic modeling, I just slightly clarify this, because when you say AI is trying to analyze text content in through a code or something, is it closer to something called data mining that we do, or is it something different that you're trying to look at? Just a small clarification.
Okay.
Because we also do, when we talk about tweets or when we talk about newspaper articles, we're also talking about data mining there. We do a lot of data mining when the quantities are doing their work. So I was just trying to understand if topic modeling and data mining are similar things, or do we club them together?
So we need two more. This, yeah.
One more question.
Want? Yeah. So, Neha, you have a question, Neha? Okay. You should use mic for people online to hear, listen. Yeah.
Professor, thank you for your lecture. My name is Neha. I am an ICSSR employee, and I would just like to ask a very brief question that in your lecture as well and in other social science lectures that we attend, there is a very huge emphasis on how the increasing role of social sciences in the ever-changing global order in IR or in evolving technological terms of AI, big data, machine learning and things like that. But nobody actually tries to ever, dwell that how humanities or social sciences can actually play the role in this changing world order. And if we relate it to the post-COVID analysis, there was a lot of buzz about that how, more social sciences should be used. And we were hoping as PhD scholars and others that yes, this would be the time where medical professionals, psychologists and social scientists, let's say ethnographers or sociologists would actually come together to look with a fresh perspective on this question, but it never happened. So this is like kind of two questions. The one is technological side, AI and data and other things, and other is the collaborative part that you talked about. And second question is, if you can answer, is mostly for the scholars like us who are doing their PhD or applying for postdocs. You talked about how dimensionality of the questionnaire, or to keep their relevance, we should first talk to the target groups and see what is relevant and then evolve or design our questionnaire. But at least in India, I do not know about the outside or the global north. We in PhDs or postdocs or MPhils or master's dissertation are not given not enough time nor enough funding to talk to target groups. So we base our our research is mostly based on existing theory, or what we call the literature review. So how what will you suggest students like them who are writing their PhD and postdoc proposals for presentation, how to use the existing theory and literature review to design a better and a more relevant questionnaire? Thank you.
Okay. So we will take one this round and then. Okay. Later. Yeah. Please go ahead. Let online see the meeting. Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Please ask your question. Yeah.
Is related to data collection. The data collection, we are doing the data from the and some of the methods of using interpretative and the procedure. But nowadays it is called
So do you want to write another question?
From the road to the survey, it's not good, it's not very late. Definitely, according to one of my related to the collection of data, that is a very validity. So that the research design must be done. So on the basis of the collective action of the data collection method, collective action of data collection method, that is the method developed by an expert from okay. This is my humble suggestion to all of you assembled here, related to don't go for the study level of data collection, and also new method of the modern method of data collection, like anticipatory data collection, what is
Yeah. So. Yeah, I think we're quite ahead of time. So I'm sure there are questions, a few questions, but we can take this to the tea, the coffee that we'll have. So please go ahead.
Okay. Okay.
You can ask.
The mixed methods question. You mentioned in passing that if you're interested, for instance, in the impact of microbanking on women in a particular area, in a rural area, then that of course you would a really good way would be to interview women of your future subject pool. But I would also probably interview the men and actually also the community leaders, because they may tell me things about what's good and what's bad about women having access to their own account that I could use for the survey. So I wouldn't just interview the women, but I know that was not your question. I just wanted to make sure that even though my actual study could be about women, learning more about either conflicts or cooperations with other people in the community would be very useful for me to know before I develop the questionnaire. Then you mentioned about the idea of how difficult it is to do a validation of a scale. Well, to be honest, very, very few social scientists actually work with a proper scale, with a psychometrically tested scale. What we usually do is we usually work with a set of questions like the World Value Survey that has been developed a long time ago in the global north, and that has been quote-unquote validated. And I know enough about statistics that while this is good for a publication, many of the questions are actually totally unsuitable for our time or for a particular context. So now this is a fork in the road. If you say, no, I want to get into this journal, so I have to use that, be my guest. But if you say, no, I want to do an impact in this community, then your decision has to be a lot harder, because maybe using an instrument that is accepted by the international community but not suitable for that particular community, you may actually decide to go into a lesser journal, but do something that is more appropriate. I give you an example. One in terms of social capital, a very well-established scale looks at friendship, and one of the questions in that scale is how much do you like your good friends? This is a stupid question. Who doesn't like their good friends? I mean, by definition, a good friend is somebody that more or less you like. But and this is the respondent. This is the response of the scale designer. Yeah, that was a mistake, but it works. Everybody's using it, so that's okay. So why change that? So again, this is almost like a fork in the road. What do you go after? And hopefully, most of the time, impact and funding and publication go together, but often they don't. Often, to get into a good journal may mean adopting a theory or an analysis that is not necessarily the one that actually the field requires. The direction of management research. Well, I think here again, this is a big fork in the road, because I see India, for instance, investing incredibly in employment and in high tech, and so. On the one hand, I can easily see management research actually promoting what is very much on the national agenda. But I also see very much the issue of sustainability becoming more and more important. And you don't even need to call it sustainability. I mean, sustainability has become also quite politicized. So you don't necessarily have to call it sustainability. Just look at the SDGs and you see that maybe community development or job creation or water quality are all part of very loosely defined sustainability. So I think management studies probably will go very much in this, not necessarily because India wants to diverge from economic I hate to use the word development, economic development, fine. But of course there are costs, and I think most policymakers are aware of this cost. The other danger about sustainability is an imposition of the global north, or maybe even Scandinavian theories, to get it to be applied in a way that are unsuitable for the trajectory that India is on. So I think management studies and sustainability in a very Indian context would probably be a very important area. I think the way I know management studies from my reviewing activities, I think there's probably a little bit of room for improvement for methods, for qualitative and for quantitative methods. I'm not so sure if there are enough drivers that will actually go in that direction, but I do think that would be really an excellent way to invest in, to set an excellent empirical design apart from some other studies that I come across. And I think also more diverse methods, and maybe more creative methods. There's two things that we actually don't teach and sometimes don't apply in our research, and that is really creativity. So we especially mixed methods, everybody does interviews and surveys, or if you're lucky you do a little bit of focus groups and surveys, but it's always the same thing. But it's actually quite amazing how, if you think about, well, what would be a more creative way to actually think at this issue? So instead of using the same theory or the same definition and the same methods, to think about, well, what would make it unusual? Would be in terms of career trajectory, likelihood of publication success. I think creativity is a very important thing that we often neglect. Because somehow academia has become also a little bit routine. And the other thing that we don't teach and sometimes don't apply is storytelling. So Indians are incredible storytellers. When we think about needing to write a scientific article, we say, okay, well, this is my research design, this is what I did, and so on. But I'm not necessarily saying that you have to now reinvent the wheel and do something very different, but what story do you have to tell? And is it all that you have to tell is that women earn less money than men for the same work? I mean, that's okay, you'll get published, but there may be, using the same phenomenon, the same issue, there may be a better way to actually tell the same thing. So storytelling and originality is something that I see management studies actually being able to benefit from. Teacher quality with regard to reliability and validity. Well, there's a whole course about that. Don't worry. Reliability and validity are very often misused because reliability and validity really refers to scale construction. So you can't really, strictly speaking, you can't say that my research results are not valid. So in its original form, reliability and validity refers to fundamentally, does your data tell you what you intended? So we're talking about construct validity, and all other validities and reliabilities are subordinate. But I'm aware that especially in the quantitative methods, that sort of has become a little bit looser of how we use that. And then, so there's a whole, I know approximately a dozen types of reliabilities and the same amount of validities, and you can, some of them are statistically based, so there are ways, for instance, to do a test-retest reliability that is statistical, and then there are other kinds of reliabilities that are sort of assumed, like construct validity. Does the item that you have in your questionnaire actually measure what you intend to measure it? That is more assumed. There's an interesting development in the last few decades where reliability validity has started to actually enter qualitative research. So there's some people who would argue that you need to adapt certain ideas from quantitative research in order to make your qualitative research more rigorous. And then there's other people who would argue, no, qualitative research needs a very different set of quality criteria that go beyond validity and reliability, but that's a whole course in itself. So I'm going to move on to the next one without satisfying your
Thank you, sir.
answer.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Okay. Ethnic minorities and how to. Okay. So I think there's a number of different things about this. The first one is actually how do you protect not only ethnic minorities, but just about everybody that you're talking about. I've spoken to Indian CEOs who told me incredibly sensitive information, and how do you protect the information and the person? So that is one thing, and the other thing is how do you get access to them? How do you create rapport in order for them to actually speak to you, and speak to you in an open-ended way? And so the one thing that whether it's focus groups or interviews, the one thing that we do wrong is we present ourselves as researchers. I'm a researcher, and you are, in your case, you are an ethnic minority, so you're not going to give me the data for my doctorate or for my article. And already this assumption, this kind of this power relationship that you set up. I mean, I mentioned earlier sort of the cultural sensitivity. We're also talking about academic cultures. Needs to be broken. So if already, I don't know what methods you're actually using, but if you already present yourself as I want to help you, but I need to know this, can you please help me? And you have the information that I don't, and this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm trying to find out, and please help me, usually goes much, much further than give me the data that I need. The other thing is also time. You need to spend time with people. It's very difficult to just say, okay, you go to a place, or what's even worse, they come to your place, and then you expect them to have a rapport, and you expect them to be open and honest with you. So actually spending time with people. Similar to coming to India more than once, you need to actually go there maybe, they need to see you maybe once or twice. It's probably better to have fewer data but high quality data than to have lots of interviews that are not really reliable because people didn't trust you. So as soon as you spend more time, or as soon as they see you more than once, people start to trust you and your interactions are completely different than if you're just saying, okay, this is an interview and these are my questions. Also think about your wording and phrasing. And yet again, this is a whole course in itself about wording and phrasing, both in interviews and surveys. How do you word and phrase things to invite people to actually respond in an open-ended way? So status difference is different, spending time with different, and wording and phrasing are incredibly important in order to create the trust. Again, a course in itself. I do hope that we have more chances to actually look at some of these topics in much more detail. Topic modeling, the question is, data mining can also be very quantitative, so it's basically just exploration, but I'm actually talking more, topic modeling refers to a much more sophisticated form of quantitative content analysis. So what is the content of 1.5 million tweets, for instance? So yes, you can, I mean, data mining is sort of more of a general term for this, but data mining can also be used for quantitative research. Topic modeling is really to look at, well, what kind of themes are in 1.5 million tweets, for instance. And so it is a further development of quantitative content analysis. Basically how to quantitatively analyze non-numeric data. And so the most primitive way used to be that it's just frequency, word frequency, or word co-occurrence. So which words co-occur, and now the more sophisticated ways are to actually look at co-occurrence in a statistically much more sophisticated way. Increasing role of social science, but how? $1 million question. I think, I mean, in an ideal, well, let's talk about a non-ideal world first. The first thing that I would probably consider is to be sympathetic to a science, so whether it's energy or water, to say, okay, I don't want to do a social science critique of technology. This is fine, you know, it's no problem. But you can say, okay, there are certain things that they have in their article or in their project that are really interesting, and then there's certain things that are that we don't quite know why they are the way they are. So for instance, in Switzerland, we had a lot of vaccine resistance to COVID. And the automatic reaction of some scientists and some politicians say, well, these are uneducated, stupid people. You could say, well, that is actually an issue. Is that right? So why don't I do a qualitative study on vaccine resistance that the health people have actually written about? And let's actually do a proper study on a small group, but do it properly. And one of the things that came out when we did a pilot around this, we looked at educated, why would educated people be resistant to it? And one of the problems that we've identified is that the medical community said there will be no long-term effects. And any educated person is going to say, how do you know? You know, what is your empirical evidence that in 20 years there are no effects on that? So one of the problems of the information that was provided, people actually, it was scientists who were saying that, but they were bending things for a particular purpose. And so a qualitative researcher, social scientist, could actually find out some really interesting ways about why do these farmers actually practice, even though they've been told 10 times not to use this kind of fertilizer or pesticide or this much of water or this kind of unsustainable practice. But why not actually explore that instead of leaving it up to the farm people, the ecological researchers to actually say, we've told them and they're doing it again, they're just ignorant. You know? So one way would be to be sympathetic to the study and to add on to it. Another way would be to start a team, you know, to sort of say, and you said earlier it's very difficult, but I wonder to what extent we could put you two in the room and say, let's actually think of something that an economist can do and would be interested in that you're a specialist in. I don't think it would be that difficult, even especially if afterwards there's like a potential for a project and some publications and some community impact. So my guess is that depending on how you present the need to or the interest to cooperate, there may actually be a lot of potential for that. Literature, there's not enough time or money for anything. One of the biggest projects that as a research counselor that I accompany are national programs that are funded for 12 years, and they have easily 100 researchers. They burn easily $100 million, and I promise you, not a single researcher is going to say we have enough time and we have enough money. So this is baked into our identity. None of us has enough time and money. I am sympathetic, especially to PhD students and to postgrads. I know, as a matter of fact, no, I'm not sympathetic, because that's probably the last time that you're allowed to work on something in this focused way. But that's a different discussion. What I'm trying to say is that in South Africa, I used to teach a course called Zero Budget Research. It is, you do not have to wait until you have a big budget. There are ways to actually do publishable research on a zero budget. I mean, of course, you have to have food, you have to have shelter, you have to have a way to get to and from the office. But there are ways to do interesting things, because one of the yet another mistake that people say is, okay, well, what is my research question? And now I need this kind of budget in order to address that question. And then, okay, we have to wait a year or 2 or 3 to develop it. If we're lucky, we're lucky. If not, and so on. This is the wrong way to start research. You know, my question is totally different. My question is, I have themes. I'm interested in themes. So I don't move from these. But I say, well, how much money do I have? How much time do I have? And then I adapt my question and my research design according to these. So it's actually a very pragmatic way to start research. So instead of saying, okay, I want to alleviate poverty in India, and that's the beginning and the end, you can say, no, I actually want to look at why X relates to Y in this community. And then I need to say, okay, how much money do I have? How much time do I have? what is my interest in this? So what do I want to do? Who do I want to work with? And what are their skills and what are their interests? And that suddenly narrows things down very quickly, and you'd be surprised how a small question is so much more interesting and easily to do research in than to always be these very, very big questions. So in that sense, there's also a lot of politics in research. So earlier I spoke about the fashions and conventions in research methods. The one thing that I left out is the politics of research. Because politics is driven by funders, is driven by, except for you of course, it's driven by department heads, it's driven by the nature of the institute, your supervisor, your PI. And we will not say we don't like your idea or your theory. We will say, are you sure that this method is rigorous enough? Or going back to the idea of reliability and validity, that's often, not always, but often a fake argument. It's like, is this method rigorous enough? Does it have validity? This often is just a discursive strategy to say, no, you should do something that I think you should do. So there's a lot of politics, and I'm not, even at my age, I'm dealing all the time with politics. I'm all the time constrained in the same way as everybody else is in the room. Nobody's free. But actually to learn the politics of a project. And what I usually do is, okay, what part can I compromise on in order to do this? And which part am I not going to compromise? And that goes back to the idea of measurement also. I always put things in there that are part of the status quo, that if my crazy idea falls flat, then I still have the standard where I can say, okay, well, this is my publication, or this is what I achieved in this project. But I always also put into my project something interesting, different, unique that I haven't seen. Sometimes it works, and then so much the better, then I can publish it, and if it doesn't work, I still have the status quo. So I strongly recommend that you find a middle way between doing what everybody does and doing something that nobody does and probably hardly anyone understands, to actually negotiate sort of a middle ground, an original middle ground, where you're safe and interesting.
Thank you so much. I really apologize, there are a lot of questions here, but I'm sure that in January next when you come, we'll have an interactive session, and these questions will take up. So on behalf of ICSR and my colleagues here, I'm really thankful to you for making this possible, and going by the responses that we have got online and the presence of this audience here, and as somebody from literature who can actually interpret gestures, claim to interpret gesture, I must say that it's a thoroughly enjoyable experience as well as has been learning. And thank you to all my colleagues and students and research staff from ICSR for taking this time. So we are really sorry because we're short of time, and we'll take your comments next time in January when we organize this. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody online for joining, sir. Thank you for your patience. It's so good to see all of you participating with your presence. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
As we conclude, I would request Professor Dhananjay Singh to present Professor Bergman with a token of gratitude.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. So everybody is invited to tea. Yeah.
You're all welcome to please have tea outside.
Yeah.
It's all arranged, and we can all have an interaction again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that all right? I do hope that we can do this again, but maybe on a much smaller.